Hello, and welcome to Early and Often, the history of elections in America. Episode 10, The Pig Who Invented Bicameralism. Last time, we followed the Pilgrims as they established a small colony at Plymouth Bay in what is now Massachusetts in 1620. The Pilgrims proved quite disruptive to the fragile balance of power in the region, but even after 10 years, Plymouth's population was only about 300. But although Plymouth wasn't too successful, its presence paved the way for bigger things. In 1629, just a few years before the founding of Maryland, Puritans began streaming into Massachusetts, totally swamping everything and everyone that had been there before. Within a decade, over 20,000 settlers would arrive. This was the real founding of New England, much as the real foundations for Virginia were only laid a decade after the settlement of Jamestown. Back when the separatists had left England for the Netherlands in the early 1600s, their rejection of the Anglican Church was very much a minority position. The Church of England hadn't adopted too many Puritan ideas, but it was close enough to their beliefs, and it had taken a live-and-let-live attitude for the most part. There were plenty of Puritan ministers and Puritan sympathizers within the Church. But James I had proven less sympathetic to the Puritans than his predecessor Elizabeth had, and his son Charles II was even less sympathetic than his father. Charles, remember, was married to a French Catholic. So throughout the 1620s and 30s, the Church clamped down on dissent and more rigorously enforced Anglican orthodoxy. Puritan sympathizing ministers were removed from their posts and Catholic-style practices were reintroduced. All of which goes a long way towards explaining why, during the English Civil War in the next decade, Puritans so resolutely sided with Parliament, and why, when Parliament won, it was in large part a Puritan victory. In the face of this official pressure, it was only natural that true believers might start considering immigration. The fringe beliefs of the Pilgrims started to seem more sensible to mainstream Puritans. And tens of thousands of Puritans did in fact pour out of England. Some went to the Netherlands, some went to the Caribbean or to Central America. Those migrations would largely be forgotten in time, but a large minority followed the Pilgrims to New England, where they managed to create for themselves an entire culture of their own that would last for centuries. In the late 1620s, a group of men, mostly prominent and wealthy Puritans or at least Puritan sympathizers, began meeting to plan out a new colonization effort in New England. Things came together quickly, and in 1629 they secured approval from King Charles for the creation of the Massachusetts Bay Company, a joint stock company like in Virginia. Indeed, the document was modeled on one of the Virginia Company's charters. This new company absorbed all the pre-existing land claims in the region, with the exception of Plymouth Colony. The company's charter gave them the right to create a government for their colony and to administer it as they saw fit. The inhabitants were to retain all the rights of Englishmen. The same sorts of things I mentioned for Virginia back in episode 2. In principle, legally, this was very similar to other past colonization efforts. But while the company's official goal was to turn a profit, for the most part religious concerns were the actual motivation. Although I'm sure they didn't make that clear to the king, nor did they talk about just how independent they wanted to be from his control. While the legal wrangling was going on, in 1628 they had sent John Endicott to New England to prepare the way for a larger colonization effort. Endicott would go on to become governor of Massachusetts for 16 years, but very little is known of his life before this period. Personality-wise, Endicott was typical of the Puritan leadership, zealous and uncompromising. He was certainly willing to persecute Indians and religious dissenters when called on to do so. Endicott arrived at what was soon named Salem, Massachusetts, of later Salem witch trial fame. This was the site of a previous failed colony, but there were still a few settlers eking out a living. Endicott and the other new arrivals took over and began constructing buildings to prepare for the coming migration. After Endicott had been there a few months, in April 1629, the main fleet set off for Massachusetts. There were 5 ships carrying maybe 300 passengers. This expedition was far better equipped and better prepared than any previous one to date. No doubt learning from past failures helped. At least they sent an advance party instead of just showing up and hoping for the best. The Puritans who were traveling to Massachusetts resembled the Pilgrims in many ways. A very large majority were coming in family groups rather than as individuals. Even the servants who came as part of a household rather than being unattached. 40% were female, and according to David Hackett Fisher, quote, nearly half were children under 16. They were somewhat better off economically than the Pilgrims had been, and much better off than the average indentured servant in Virginia. The Puritan immigrants were generally what we'd call middle class, and basically no aristocrats went, so the top of the social hierarchy was missing as well. They were artisans and merchants as well as farmers who owned their own land. But farmers were a minority. Instead, the migration was very disproportionately urban. They were unusually well educated too. 2/3 of the men were at least literate enough to sign their own names. and there was a large group of highly educated ministers as well. So the Puritans were educated, egalitarian, middle class, and hyper-religious, and that was what New England would be for a long time to come. After an easy voyage, the Puritans arrived at Salem that summer and were met by Endicott. There were no moments of big drama like in Jamestown or Plymouth, they just got to work. Thanks to the healthy climate and adequate preparations, there was no big die-off that first year. Everything went well for once. The success was encouraging. The next year, an even larger fleet of 11 ships carrying about 1,000 passengers set sail. This fleet was led by John Winthrop, aged about 42, who would go on to be governor of Massachusetts for 12 years. He's important, so let me give you some background. John Winthrop was born in 1587, the son of a prosperous lawyer/landowner. As a young man, Winthrop followed his father to Cambridge University. By the time he was in his early 20s, he was becoming extremely devout and concerned for the state of his soul. He soon became a staunch Calvinist. He held various minor offices and basically behaved as someone with his status was expected to. He was by disposition an egalitarian. Social inequality was part of God's will, after all. In his words, quote, "In all time, some must be rich, some poor, some high and eminent in power and dignity, others mean and in subjection. Great men were to show mercy to their inferiors, and lesser men were to show obedience to their betters. The laws of the state should be based on those found in the Bible, though with additions as needed. The common people were incapable of self-government. He didn't believe in natural rights or liberty or anything like that. Rather, he instead believed that men submitted themselves to a divinely ordained central authority, and then that central authority could grant its subjects rights on a case-by-case basis. The authorities themselves shouldn't have too many constraints on their power, other than their individual consciences and their devotion to God." This was a rather Hobbesian view, although he was writing decades before Thomas Hobbes penned Leviathan. But Winthrop had more immediate concerns than political philosophy. He was facing financial problems, and Charles had just stopped calling parliaments and was trying to rule on his own. The Puritan cause seemed weak. So Winthrop, disheartened both personally and politically, contacted the Massachusetts Bay Company and helped organize a fleet. Thanks to his status and his drive, he immediately became an important figure in the project and was soon elected as the next governor of Massachusetts. He also helped come up with a clever idea to secure greater Puritan control over the colony. It was proposed that, basically, the Puritans in Massachusetts buy out the investors in the company who are in England and transfer the entire company from London to America. That would transfer almost total control to the Puritans. This was questionable legally and certainly against the intention of the colony's charter. But they did it anyway. Now, with the company nothing more than a legal formality, Massachusetts would have almost total independence and almost no duties or obligations toward England. The company was fast becoming just a government. Winthrop's fleet of 11 ships set sail in the summer of 1630. While at sea, Winthrop gave the famous City Upon a Hill speech, where he said that, quote, "The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world. We shall open the mouths of enemies to speak evil of the ways of God, and all professors for God's sake." In other words, Massachusetts was to be a model for right Christian living, and its failure would damage true Christianity the world over. Winthrop arrived at Salem, but the Puritans found the town to be too small for their needs, so settlers spread out quickly along the coast, founding a number of new towns, including Boston, which soon became the capital thanks to its advantageous harbor. 200 colonists died that winter, though that was about the worst of it. Conditions improved rapidly, and the Puritans set out building their new society. As far as the economy goes, from an early date the New England colonies were engaged in trades such as fishing and shipping. Shipyards were opened in the 1640s, and a small commercial culture began to grow as soon as the initial settlement phase was over. Boston, in particular, became relatively cosmopolitan. But of course, most New Englanders were still just farmers living in small towns scattered throughout the region. In the more northerly climate of New England, it was much harder to profitably grow cash crops like in the Chesapeake, so big plantations never emerged. Family farms were the norm, and these tended to be similar enough in size. In a typical town, the largest farm might be no more than a few times bigger than the average one. There were no landowners who had orders of magnitude more than their neighbors. In fact, in some towns, plots of land were given out at random, with each family drawing lots. Some families were wealthier than others, of course, but there were few poor and few rich. Indeed, the poor, and to a lesser extent the aristocracy, were actively discouraged from migrating. There were still ranks, but the top and bottom were just closer than usual. Cities and ports were less egalitarian, but they were just a small part of New England's social fabric. Another important difference with the Chesapeake is that there was less fertile soil and there were fewer navigable rivers. These factors encouraged the settlers to live in towns rather than spread out across far-flung plantations. These small towns became the religious and political centers of New England life. By far the most important building in any town was the church. Puritan churches, or meeting houses, were tremendously ascetic, made of unpainted wood and entirely undecorated inside, other than a single staring eye painted on the pulpit to remind them of God's omnipresence. Each Sunday, parishioners sat through 2 separate hours-long sermons, each analyzing some fragment of the Bible. They were a very, very grim people, paranoid about their spiritual health and about unnaturalness. According to Fisher, quote, 90% of executions for witchcraft in British America occurred in the Puritan colonies. From the very first church in Salem onwards, the Puritans followed a congregational model, where each community had an independent compact with God and was largely in charge of its own affairs. They hired their own ministers and admitted new members themselves. Just to clarify, people who weren't members of their local church would have still attended church, they just weren't official members, that's all. There was some overarching authority, of course, but nothing like you'd find in the Church of England. The government could call for synods to be held, meetings that would keep the various churches on the same track, but they were still all ultimately independent. They weren't totally breaking away from Anglican authority, at least not officially, but they were coming pretty close. Of course, not everyone in Massachusetts was a Puritan, but 2/3 or more of the colonists were, and half of the remainder were servants of the Puritans anyway, so that was still the dominant way of thinking. And this overwhelming religiosity permeated the government as much as it did everything else. There were distinctions between civil and religious authority. In fact, the separation between religious and civil officials was much greater than in England, where the positions often overlapped. In England, a minister might also have a role in town government, but not in New England. Puritans, of course, saw this as a return to the original church before it had been corrupted by involvement in politics. But still, government officials saw it as their duty to enforce Puritan beliefs with the full force of the law. Religious dissenters were sometimes executed, and Quakers, who were heretics in Puritan eyes, had their faces branded or their ears cut off. And there were plenty of laws that may not have been religious per se, but were certainly grounded in a desire to enforce the community's sense of upright behavior. The Puritans strictly regulated how people lived. Nobody was allowed to live on their own. Single men in their own houses were forced to move in with families. The profits of businessmen were curtailed and idleness was strictly punished. These weren't all unusual. Other societies were opposed to excessive profits and idleness, but the Puritans were far more rigorous in their control. Punishments went all the way up to being burned alive, though hanging was more usual. Not for idleness, of course. For lesser crimes, public humiliation was common. But although these laws were strict, they didn't need to be enforced all that frequently, since law-breaking was relatively uncommon. Life in Massachusetts wasn't actually an endless parade of punishment or anything. Interestingly, because of their strict reading of the Bible, marriage was seen as a civil matter rather than a religious one, and divorce was relatively easier than elsewhere at the time. So as you can see, the fact that the Puritans were so religious didn't always mean that everything was subordinated to the church. There were separate sources of authority, even if those separate sources were still ultimately secondary to the will of God. Despite the presence of elections, the goal of a Puritan government was not to follow the will of the people, or to ensure individual liberty. What liberty there was the liberty to be a proper Puritan. Popular participation in government was a means to an end, the establishment of a godly regime. They didn't consider themselves democratic, although they did believe that power in society came from the bottom up rather than the top down. But that bottom-up power meant different things to different people. To Governor Winthrop, it meant that the people surrendered themselves to a rather absolute authority. To others, it meant genuine popular control. The fight between these two views was played out in the fight over the colony's charter. Massachusetts' charter was a de facto constitution, which detailed how the government was supposed to operate. Overall, it was somewhat similar to that in Virginia, at least structurally. There was to be a governor, a deputy governor, and 18 assistants, or magistrates, who had a somewhat similar role to the councilors in Virginia, forming a sort of executive council. Unlike in the Chesapeake, all of these positions were to be filled by annual elections, with the freemen of the colony voting each spring, unlike the irregularly scheduled elections for just the burgesses in Virginia. Additionally, there was to be a general court, which was the equivalent of the General Assembly. This was a unicameral body consisting of the governor, deputy governor, magistrates, and the freemen of the colony, or at least their representatives, although the exact nature of that representation was kept vague in the charter. The General Court was to meet 4 times a year, and it had the power to pass laws and appoint men to various offices. So like I said, this was similar enough to Virginia at the time, but of course the fact that all of these offices were to be elected was a quite significant departure. However, the colony's leaders weren't always willing to adhere to the charter's generous provisions. In the colony's first few years, things were simply too unsettled for the charter to be followed. Endicott, since he was the leader on site, served as governor, but there was no real formal structure beyond that, and the arrival of Winthrop upended things yet again. Winthrop became governor, but his first term was irregular. He was appointed in England rather than elected, and his term both began before it was supposed to begin and ended after it was supposed to end. In other words, they were winging it. In fact, when Winthrop got to Massachusetts, the earliest meetings of the government were simply held under a tree. But although things in the colony soon settled down and moved indoors, that didn't mean that the charter was now going to be followed. None of these earliest officials were elected, and frankly Governor Winthrop would have been happy to keep it that way. Democracy was, in the words of Winthrop, quote, the meanest and worst of all forms of government, and more importantly, democracy lacked biblical sanction, unlike monarchy. He sure didn't believe in representative government, and so he tried to limit the representative nature of government as much as possible. In his mind, and in the minds of many leaders of the colony, at most elections were there for the leaders merely to affirm their position. Representation existed to justify a de facto oligarchy. Elections weren't supposed to be a real outlet for popular opinion or anything like that, at least that was the idea according to some. Now, the charter called for a general court to be held 4 times a year to represent the freemen. But freeman was, as always, a vague term, especially in a colony with so few servants. So the very earliest general courts that first year in 1630 were, I think, just meetings of whichever colonist showed up. Obviously, this would not do. So in 1631, Governor Winthrop decided that, quote, no man shall be admitted to the freedom of this body politic, but such as are members of some of the churches within the limits of the same. Political participation was being limited to men who were members of their local church. In other words, just to the Puritans of the colony, since they were the ones setting up the churches. This religious test was in quite flagrant violation of the rights that had been given to all freemen, but who's going to stop it? Also contrary to the charter was the decision to cut meetings of the general court from 4 times a year down to 1. Many of the 18 magistrate positions were left vacant. They also ended the direct elections of the governor and deputy governor. Instead, the magistrates were to pick governors from among themselves, and the ability to create laws was taken away from the general court and given just to the governor and his magistrates. Winthrop raised taxes without popular consent, which of course raised fears of Stuart despotism. The governor and his allies were moving hard and fast against elections, and breaking the law to do so. If he had had his way, elections would have had no real connection to any actual power. However, all of these arbitrary and illegal limits on popular government got pushback from the colonists and even from the deputy governor, and so many of Winthrop's changes had to be rolled back within a few years. The direct elections of governor and deputy governor were restored in 1632, though not completely. Voters were still limited to choosing men who had also been elected as magistrates. And lawmaking was returned to the general court, which was additionally given the exclusive power to raise taxes, as with any good English legislature. 2 years later, the assembly was again called to meet 4 times a year. In this modified system, the freemen of each town were to send 2 or 3 men to meet in 3 general courts a year, while the freemen themselves would meet together for the 4th general court, to vote for the governor and magistrates. So some, but not all, of the changes were successfully reversed. Most importantly, the restriction of voting rights to church members was kept in place. Although most colonists were Puritans, that didn't mean they were all formally members of their local church, since gaining membership was an arduous process involving lengthy interviews where you had to prove your religious sincerity. And of those who were church members, not all bothered to formally become freemen either, since that could mean more work with little benefit. But maybe half of all adult men were freemen in those first few decades, though estimates vary. Very high by the standards of the day, at least. Plus, towns often had looser requirements for voting than the court did, which I'll talk about in a few episodes. Women could and did send petitions to the court, but that was the extent of their formal participation. Moving on to the elections themselves. Officials in the first few years of Massachusetts history weren't elected the way officials are today, with voters showing up to the precinct nearest them to cast their ballots, which are all then counted up. Instead, voters actually had to be in Boston on election day to cast their votes. This was called the Court of Election. Of course, this system meant that the well-to-do and those who lived in Boston had an advantage over everyone else thanks to their simple ability to show up. So this system was modified quickly in 1634. Now, the men of a town could write their votes on paper ballots and send a deputy to Boston to deliver their votes to be counted. If no candidate received a majority, the election was decided by the General Court. This was a practice distinctive to the region. England and the other American colonies all still voted by voice or by show of hands. Although voting was now done with ballots, the system was still, at best, semi-anonymous. Certainly, anonymity wasn't a goal anyone had in mind at the time. You didn't have to sign your name on your ballot generally, but you still would have had to hand it in, visible for all to see. There were no special precautions for privacy yet. Actually, for a few decades, people voted for magistrates not with a paper ballot but with kernels of corn. If you wished to approve of someone's nomination as a magistrate, you would drop a white kernel of corn in a hat. If you disapproved, you would drop in a black kernel. The deputy from your town would then take the corn to Boston to be counted, avoiding as many birds as possible, I assume. But as Massachusetts grew, so did the number of deputies, until even this system proved unwieldy. There were multiple attempts to cut back on the number of deputies, but the towns would have none of it. It seems to me like it would have been simpler just to tabulate the votes in each town and send those totals to Boston instead of this more elaborate procedure, but perhaps there were concerns about fraud. Or perhaps it was just traditional and no one thought to change it. But in any case, similar systems of paper ballots, and corn, would be adopted by several other of the New England colonies. Elections in Massachusetts began at 8 a.m., with a no doubt rousing Election Day sermon. Soon Election Day in the towns became a festive holiday, with the serving of election cakes and election beer, a tradition sadly forgotten today. I actually found a recipe for election cake, though it's from over a century later and may have been different from what was served in those first few decades. The recipe, for one extremely large fruit cake, reads as follows, quote, 30 quarts flour, 10 pounds butter, 14 pounds sugar, 12 pounds raisins, 3 dozen eggs, 1 pint wine, 1 quart brandy, 4 ounces cinnamon, 4 ounces fine colander seed, 3 ounces ground allspice. Wet the flour with the milk to the consistency of bread overnight, adding 1 quart yeast. The next morning work the butter and sugar together for half an hour, which will render the cake much lighter and whiter. When it has risen light, work in every other ingredient except the plums, which you work in when going into the oven. Sounds like quite a production. You can find modernized recipes for smaller election cakes online if you just Google election cake. Let me know if you make one. Given all the effort that went into them, it's clear that New Englanders cared a great deal about elections. Remember, they did all that each and every year. It wasn't just for show. There were in fact some contested elections and changes in power. For instance, after Governor Winthrop's attempts to limit popular participation were rebuffed, he lost the next election to one of his rivals and was out of power for a few years, though he'd be back. But elections were still much less partisan than today, and the turnover of officials wasn't that rapid either, apart from the first decade. Officials were more likely to step down of their own accord than to lose re-election. I mean, the governorship was held by a rotating group of just 4 men for 41 of the next 43 years, so stability was pretty high. There's one other early political development to discuss, the division of the General Court into an upper and lower house. In Virginia and Maryland, the split was due to the division between the unelected councilors and the elected representatives. In Massachusetts, both the deputies and the magistrates were elected, but there was still a split. The delegates were more in tune with popular opinion, while the magistrates were a bit more elite. It didn't take long for the two groups to become irrevocably at odds, and it was all thanks to a completely minor disagreement over a single pig. More specifically, a lawsuit over a sow. In 1636, there was a stray pig wandering around Boston. No one else claimed it, so it was taken by Robert Keene, a wealthy moneylender. When a year went by and still no one had claimed the sow, Keene had it slaughtered. But after the pig was dead, a lawsuit was brought against Keene by Goodwife Sherman, on behalf of her husband who was in England at the time. Sherman claimed that they had lost a pig of their own, and that it was the same one which Keene had unjustly taken and killed. The evidence was apparently against her, and she lost her suit. However, popular sympathy was with Sherman, since she was from a poor but well-known and well-liked family, while Keene was rich and unpopular. Keene brought a countersuit for defamation, which went before the General Court, which at this time also sometimes acted like a real court, not just a legislature. The case split the court in two. Most magistrates found for Keene, but most deputies found for Sherman. There were more deputies than magistrates, so Sherman got the most support, but unfortunately for her, just getting a majority was insufficient. You also had to get the approval of the magistrates specifically, since they could, on their own, block any action from the delegates, just like how in Virginia the council could veto laws passed by the burgesses. This negative vote, as it was called, was a way for the magistrates to keep the deputies in check. It gave the elite a way to negate popular power. This led to a quite acrimonious dispute between the deputies and the magistrates over whether this negative vote should be kept. This was basically a continuation of the disagreement between Winthrop and the deputies over the powers of the legislature, with the deputies still pushing to increase their own power. Relations between the two factions got pretty acrimonious, and in 1644, the dispute was finally resolved by dividing the general court into an upper and lower house, both of which had to approve all legislation. Now, both the magistrates and the deputies could block laws. This was right about at the same time as when Governor Berkeley probably split the General Assembly, and just 6 years before Maryland's assembly became bicameral. But the running dispute between the deputies and the magistrates continued, over various constitutional issues like who should be in charge when the general court was out of session. And there were further attempts to place some officials beyond the reach of elections altogether. For instance, some of the magistrates tried to form a new body, where a few of them could just serve for life, but that attempt was blocked. Winthrop even tried to block the court from writing a law code, since he thought that that would impinge upon the freedom of the magistrates to do as they wished. He argued that there was no need for a law code since the magistrates' oath of office pledging to protect the well-being of the state was sufficient to keep them from behaving tyrannically, even without any formal limits on their power. That argument was rejected, but the disputes were such that it took some 15 years for a satisfactory law code to be passed. But eventually, things settled down after both sides had reached a compromise position. In essence, elections remained the ultimate source of authority, but the governor and magistrates remained powerful in their own right. And voting was still limited to church members. The colony's charter wasn't being followed precisely, but neither had it been thrown out completely. As its form of government was being worked out, Massachusetts was developing in other ways. During the 1630s, some 200 ships carrying some 20,000 colonists came to New England. By 1647, there were 33 different towns in Massachusetts. Laws were passed in the New England colonies mandating that all children be taught to read. According to Fisher, another law, quote, compelled every town of 50 families to hire a schoolmaster, and every town of 100 families to keep a grammar school, which offered instruction in Latin and Greek. And children in Massachusetts got twice as much schooling as those in Virginia. This was mostly to teach kids the Bible, but of course literacy has many other benefits. Harvard University was established in 1636, while the first college in Virginia, William and Mary, would only be founded in 1693. Now, Harvard at the time wasn't a prestigious and world-renowned university like it is today. It was mainly just a school for the training of ministers, but the difference is still striking. And the first printing press in New England was set up in 1638, a full 90 years before the first one in Virginia. Perhaps partly because of this focus on education, the Puritans proved to be financially successful. The colonies weren't profitable in the way that the plantations of the Caribbean were, but the colonists themselves were able to live quite well by the standards of the day. The Puritan migrants had been middle class in England, and they remained middle class in New England. They were allowed to do all this, to build their own quite distinct society, without any real interference from the crown, which may seem surprising given Charles's obvious hostility to the Puritans. Why did he let this happen? After all, it's not like Massachusetts was totally cut off. People went back and forth, and word certainly got out about what sort of society the Puritans were building, and how hostile it was to the English establishment. I mean, they acknowledged the king's authority only grudgingly, and their churches had completely broken away from the Anglican bishops. Well, there were some concerns raised, but there was only so much that could be done. Remember, this is the decade when King Charles was ruling without Parliament, so he was busy just keeping everything together in England, and by the end of the decade he was sucked into a war in Scotland. And of course after that, the English Civil War hit, and no one at all in England cared about the colonies. And in any case, the Puritans were less of a threat over there than at home. So despite various worries, New England was mostly left to do its own thing, at least for the time being. Next episode, we'll talk about the other colonies of New England, Maine, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, and how they built upon the Massachusetts way of doing things while making significant innovations of their own. So join me next time on Early and Often, the history of elections in America. If you like the podcast, please rate it on iTunes. You can also keep track of Early and Often on Twitter at EarlyOftenPod, or read transcripts of every episode at the blog at earlyandoftenpodcast.wordpress.com. Thanks for listening.